Joining me now is Mike Wassenaar. He's the president of Alliance for Community Media, and is a very important ruling that we want to talk about that could affect media in your neck of the woods. Mike, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you, Cenk. It's good to be here.
No problem, Mike. First of all, what's the Alliance for Community Media?
Well, the Alliance for Community Media is an association of community media channels across the country. We are public, educational, and government access channels on cable systems. Very often nonprofits, sometimes local governments, sometimes based in educational institutions and colleges, devoted to non-commercial content creation at the local level.
So cable access, where you might see some local proceedings like city council, et cetera.
That's right. It's small town television in a lot of places around the country. So you'll see local and county government meetings taking place, but you'll also see local high school sports, community events, performances, local discussion, local authors. It's kind of the last best bastion of local content you see, rather than having media channels that come from New York, Los Angeles, other places around the country. That's all well and good, but if you're in someplace in Nebraska or New Hampshire and you want to actually see what's going on in your community, it's typically on that channel.
Right, and look, this one's personal for me because of two things. First, the fun one. When I was in high school, I played football, and so they carried the local high school football games. We all loved it. We got to see ourselves on television. We had reporters and announcers saying, "Oh, Cenk Uygur, he'll hit anybody." That was a ton of fun. And you know one other thing that it did? It brought our community together.
So here's the thing that's important about that. It's not just you. It's still relatively rare for someone to be on television in America. I mean, I know that sounds weird to think about since television has been in our homes since the 1950s. But the idea of someone creating content that then gets distributed out, or rather, let's say you're in a community that is often misrepresented in the mainstream media. The idea of seeing yourself and having your story told is still unique in America. So that's that community power that you're talking about. And so it's not just hitting that pass with high school sports, but it's being able to tell your story if you're in a community that's often misrepresented. I was in the Twin Cities for many years. I worked with Somali Minnesotans. They're a community that I think is being attacked right now here in 2019. And they're a community that is devoted to telling their own story and having their history be known for other Minnesotans, and they do that through community television. So that's sort of an empowering moment and an important thing for us to remember about the mission of access television is that we're trying to make sure that media actually looks like the communities that we're supposed to be serving.
So we're going to talk about what the government is doing wrong in a second, but one last story about how it's personal to me. This one's actually important. I started in media on cable access. It was a show originally called The Young Turk because back then it was just me, and it was Channel 33 in Arlington, Virginia, and it provided an opportunity for a different voice. And it turns out that a lot of people did eventually want that voice, but if I had to just rely on normal television or radio, that voice probably would have never gotten out. And there are other great people who work here, like Malcolm Fleshner, also had a show there, another different voice. I remember there was a transgender show, and this was back in the 1990s, mid-90s, and people would snicker, et cetera. But you know what it did? It planted a seed, and eventually that blossomed, and it would have never made it onto traditional press. And now we have so many more people who understand the plight of the LGBT community, and that's all because of cable access. So of course, something this good, the government's gonna want to kill off.
Well, I think it's this question of local control and local voice that I think can be very, very threatening to authority. I think the other thing that we should just recognize here is that people with power want to just consolidate power or alternatively make more money. So in the case of this FCC action that we're talking about, I think the end game, if you will, for the cable industry is to try to find ways to squeeze local governments so that they give up the channels so that they can then sell more advertising on yet another classic golf channel or some other type of shopping channel that they own, manipulate, and control. So it's really, at the end of the day, about just trying to squeeze more pennies out of consumers and reduce the diversity of local voice across America.
Yeah, and by the way, it works because people say, oh, cable access. Sometimes in the now this is a long time ago, so a lot of people probably don't even remember Wayne's World, and they would make those kind of references. But the reality is, I remember when we did the shows, everybody in Arlington knew it. Right?
See, I think that's an important distinction, Cenk. I mean, it's easy to ridicule someone who wants to be creative and connect with other people. I mean, and I think that's the problem with that Wayne's World stereotype, is that there's a desire that people have in this country to connect with one another. It's legitimate, and it's a desire that's not being met by our media systems. So the idea that a funny-looking kid like you or me can get involved in media, create media that's important for the communities that we're a part of, the neighborhoods that we're a part of, and not necessarily be a network anchor. That's not really the goal of a lot of the work that happens. The goal of the work that happens on these channels is to make sure that the local neighbors have a chance to understand what's happening in their world and get information that's important to them, and I think build the human potential that people have in their communities. That's your story, and we see that multiplied in communities across the country.
Yeah, and I thought, what a wondrous place America is, that you could even get your own TV show. It's just the most amazing thing I'd ever heard at that point. So now let's talk about the present day. So what is the FCC doing that could endanger all this?
Well, the FCC is trying to redefine what a franchise fee is. Since 1984, communities across the country have been able to enter into contracts for the use of public property, cable franchises, and in return for cable companies being able to use public property to be able to make money, if you will, there's a rent that gets paid, that franchise fee. Congress intended that those franchise fees be monetary, that you get a certain percentage of revenue going back for maintenance of streets and also the capacity to be able to work on those cable systems. And they also set aside cable channels if communities wanted to use them. Now, this FCC under Ajit Pai has wanted to redefine what a franchise fee is to ensure that communities get less monetary support. That monetary support is capped by Congress at 5% of gross revenue. So if a cable company can come up with a monetary value that they can charge back in a hidden fee, they can take money away from local communities if they have channels operating. And that's, I think, the great danger that we see from this order, is that it opens the door for very, very large corporations with very, very large legal staffs to basically bully small towns across the country that don't have the taxing ability to be able to backfill, $5,000, $6,000, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 that a cable company might suddenly claim is a hidden fee that they're charging back against the franchise. So it's a way to be able to put extreme pressure on local government that can't react.
So when you say public property, people might not understand what you mean by that. What do you mean the cable networks are using public property? So
the streets that you walk on are public. They're not private. The sidewalk you walk on is not private. That's public. We have to be able, in many instances, either to dig up the streets to be able to lay fiber in our communities, or alternatively, you've got to be able to have access to poles and be able to make pole attachments. So what typically happens is a company will sign a master contract to have the right to be able to cross public property to get to your house or to get to your apartment building to be able to make money. So it's a way to make sure that there's some order rather than chaos with the use of that public property. I mean, so in no small way are we talking about sort of giving local rights to property away to corporations with this kind of order.
So look, I know you want to be nonpartisan, but we have to be fact-based here. So how did the FCC vote break down along party lines?
So it was a 3-2 vote. The Republican appointees all voted for this because they believe that local governments are criminal agencies, that they want to get rid, in some cases, of community channels, or in other instances, they think that basically local governments are just lining their pockets because they're in the interest of shaking down corporations like Comcast or Charter. Exactly. The two dissenting votes were Democrats. They were concerned about the diversity of media in America, as well as the application of law in this instance. You know, the law that was written in 1984 had been abided by for 35 years. Local governments and cable companies were able to put contracts together for their operation without disputes in many instances. So suddenly, with a new majority in the FCC, you see basically contracts that exist basically being disrupted. And if this order will be published in, say, a week or two, by mid-September to the end of September, you'll actually see local governments start to get notices, I think, from cable companies that say that, you know, the rent is due, that they need to be paid back for things like institutional networks to libraries and fire stations. I mean, so for example, the city of New York has a really pretty deep concern that they will be over the barrel and not be able to react financially to what will be a demand letter suddenly for fiber connections to all public buildings in New York City. What's that dollar amount going to look like? I mean, so this is actually a pretty bad instance where you have, I think, a Republican majority that likes subsidizing corporations and picking on local government. And you see this sort of like over and over again in the rulings that have happened in the last 3 years with this FCC. Yeah. And I know you don't want to get political, but the one thing that Americans typically have control about when it comes to telecom policy in the FCC is that the president of the United States has the right to appoint a chair. So whoever is president in 2021 will appoint the next chair of the FCC. And the chair of the FCC determines a great deal about the agenda when it comes to telecom policy, whether it be local media, these channels that we're talking about, Cenk, net neutrality, other issues across America. So the 2020 election does matter when it comes to telecom policy. And I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but I can give you a hint.
Yeah, well, it's in the voting record, obviously. And so, look, we gotta go, but I'm glad that the Republicans have finally done, the brave thing of standing up for poor multinational billion-dollar corporations. I mean, they're so downtrodden in this world, and finally somebody's here to stick up for them. But Mike, before we let you go, is there anything people can do right now?
Well, right now, people can contact their local governments to see what they can do to help out. In some instances, if you have contact with a local media center, a public educational and government access center, contact them because they actually may need to have financial support in the coming months. We're actually talking with a lot of the channels across the country to figure out ways that they can strategically survive if there's a legal battle that takes place when this order goes forward. Because we're going to be seeing increased financial pressure on both local government as well as the nonprofits, like the one you talked about in Arlington, that do that work. So if you care about local media, contact that local PEG operation, that public educational and government access operation, and see if you can help.
And the website is allcommunitymedia.org. All right, Mike.
allcommunitymedia.org. It's great to be here, Cenk.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.